Okay, well, welcome along. Let's make a start. So, over the past several weeks, we've been talking about the reliability of the Gospels and Acts, surveying different categories of both internal and external evidence for the substantial trustworthiness of the Gospels and Acts. They're grounding in eyewitness testimony. We've also reviewed historical objections to the Gospels and Acts in terms of alleged discrepancies between these sources, as well as discrepancies between the biblical sources and external secular sources. And we've shown that these are not very convincing reasons to discount the trustworthiness of the Gospels. And in fact, there are some very compelling arguments to think that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of individuals who are well informed, close up to the facts, and in the habit of being truthful. This evening, we're going to be looking at the evidence specifically for the authorship of the Gospels and Acts. Now, it's not essential to my case that the authors of the Gospels are those to whom they've been traditionally assigned: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The arguments for their grounding in eyewitness testimony and their strong trustworthiness stand independently of whether that case is successful. But nonetheless, I think that if I can successfully make a good argument for the traditional authorship of the Gospels and Acts, that provides even further reason to take them seriously as composed by individuals who are in the know and close up to the facts. So let's begin with a quote from Bar Ehrman. This is from his book, Jesus Interrupted. It says, "There were some books, such as the Gospels, that had been written anonymously, only later to be ascribed to certain authors who probably did not write them, apostles and friends of the apostles." And so this is a very common view in New Testament scholarship, that the Gospels were originally composed anonymously, they circulated anonymously, and the names that are now associated with the Gospels only came to be associated with them much later. Now, it may come as a surprise to some viewing that there's actually not a single Greek manuscript that's sufficiently complete, that we have the first and last page, where the name is not attached to the manuscript. And so here's a list. This is from Brown Preacher's book, The Case for Jesus. And you can see that these are a list of various papyri fragments and manuscripts that contain the name. So Papyrus 4, for example, dating to the 2nd century, the gospel title given is the Gospel according to Matthew. Papyrus 62, again, the Gospel according to Matthew. In Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, which is the first complete New Testament, again, got according to Matthew. Got Codex Vaticanus according to Matthew, and so forth. And so for every manuscript that's sufficiently complete, that we have the first and last page, we find that the name is attached to the manuscript. And so since we don't have the original autographs of any of the New Testament books, it's very difficult to say with any level of confidence that the original autographs lacked the name, didn't have the name associated with the manuscript. There are so when scholars say that the gospel circulated anonymously, I mean, that's technically true. It's true in a technical sense, namely that the name of the author to whom it's attributed does not appear in the text itself. But that's not to say that the name didn't appear on the manuscript. And in fact, as we'll see, there's actually reasons to think that the original manuscripts probably didn't circulate anonymously and probably did have names attached to them. So there's basically two major approaches that one can take to arguing for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Those are external attestations to authorship, and secondly, internal evidence of authorship. So let's begin with the external attestations to authorship. Well, let me read, first of all, a quote from Augustine of Hippo, who wrote around 480. And he discusses how we, in other realms of historical inquiry, come to decide who the probable author is of a particular work. And so he says, and I quote, "How can we be sure of the authorship of any book if we doubt the apostolic origin of those books, which are attributed to the apostles by the church, which the apostles themselves founded, and which occupies so conspicuous a place in all lands? And if at the same time we acknowledge as the undoubted production of the apostles what is brought forward by heretics in opposition to the church, whose authors from whom they derive their name lived long after the apostles? And do we not see in profane literature that there are well-known authors under whose names many things have been published after their time, which have been rejected either from inconsistency with their ascertained writings or from their not having been known in the lifetime of the authors, so as to be handed down with the confirmatory statement of the authors themselves or of their friends? To give a single example, were not some books published lately under the name of the distinguished physician Hippocrates, which were not received as authoritative by physicians? And this decision remained unaltered in spite of some similarity in style and matter. For when compared to the genuine writings of Hippocrates, these books were found to be inferior, besides that they were not recognized as his at the time when his authorship of his genuine productions were ascertained. These books, again, from a comparison with which the productions of questionable origin were rejected, are with certainty attributed to Hippocrates, and anyone who denies their authorship is answered only by ridicule, simply because there is a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know that the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? So also with the numerous commentaries on the ecclesiastical books, which have no canonical authority, and yet show a desire of usefulness and a spirit of inquiry, how is the authorship ascertained in each case, except by the author's having brought his work into public notice as much as possible in his own lifetime, and by the transmission of the information from one to another in continuous order, the belief becoming more certain as it becomes more general up to our own day, so that when we are questioned as to the authorship of any book, we have no difficulty in answering. But why speak of old books? Take the books now before us. Should anyone, after some years, deny that this book was written by me, or that Faustus was written by him, where is evidence for the fact to be found, but in the information possessed by some at the present time, and transmitted by them through successive generations, even to distant times? From all this, it follows that no one who has not yielded to the malicious and deceitful suggestions of lying devils can be so blinded by passion as to deny the ability of the church, of the apostles, a community of brethren as numerous as they were faithful, to transmit their writings unaltered to posterity, as the original seats of the apostles have been occupied by a continuous succession of bishops to the present day, especially when we are accustomed to see this happen in the case of ordinary writings, both in the church and out of it, end quote. And so Augustine, again, is calling for some consistency, that we attribute secular writings to a particular author because of testimony from other ancient individuals. And so given the unanimous and uniform testimony to the traditional authorship of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, why hesitate in attributing them to those authors to whom they have been historically and traditionally assigned? So let's look at some of the early church literature and the attributions that they make of authorship. So Papias of Hierapolis, who wrote anywhere between 60 and 130, and was possibly a disciple of some of the apostles. He's traditionally said to be a disciple of John the Apostle. He says we don't actually have any Papias's writings, but what we do have of Papias is preserved in quotations of Papias by Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote in the 300s AD. And Eusebius quotes Papias as saying, and I quote, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took especial care not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements." End quote. Another quote from Papias: "Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could." Now, so Papias makes allusion to Matthew and Mark. Now, one concern that a lot of scholars have concerning Papias is that he refers to Matthew as being composed in the Hebrew language. And he also then refers to it as the oracles of the Lord, which suggests that Matthew is a sayings gospel. And it's unanimously agreed upon for very good reason that Matthew is, our Matthew is not a Greek translation of a Hebrew Matthew. And so there's a debate and dispute as to whether Papias is referring to the same Matthew, the same Gospel of Matthew that we have in our New Testament today. I think that a possible solution here is to propose that there was, in fact, a sayings gospel, or the oracles of the Lord, which was composed originally by Matthew, and then it was subsequently expanded, perhaps under Matthew's direction, into our Greek Matthew that we have today. So that would be a very plausible view, and there are certainly scholars who subscribe to such a view. So that was Papias, and then another early church father. This is the middle of the 2nd century now. Justin Martyr. He wrote his first apology somewhere between 155 and 157 AD, and that dating is based on the reference to Lucius Manatius Felix as a recent prefect of Egypt. And he says, for the apostles in the memoirs composed by them, which are called gospels, have thus delivered unto us what was enjoined upon them, that Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, said, this do ye in remembrance of me, this is my body. And that after the same manner, having taken the cup and given thanks, he said, this is my blood, and gave it to them alone. Now, Justin Martyr actually had a student called Tatian who composed the Diatessaron, which is actually a harmony of the four Gospels. And the four Gospels that he produces a harmony of, namely the Diatessaron, are the four Gospels that we have in our New Testament canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So when he talks about the apostles in the memoirs of the apostles, which are called Gospels, it seems very plausible, it seems very probable that he's talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then another quote from Justin Martyr: on this day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in this country gather together in one place, and the memoirs of the apostles, so the writing of the prophets, are read as long as time permits. In his dialogue with Trypho, Jewish rabbi in the 2nd century, he says, and I quote, for in the memoirs which I say were drawn up by his apostles and those who followed them, it is recorded that his sweat fell down like drops of blood while he was praying, and so on. And so I notice that he refers to the memoirs, which he's also said in his first apology are also called Gospels, the memoirs of the apostles and those who followed them. Again, very consistent with Matthew and John being apostles, those who followed them being Matthew and Luke, being Mark and Luke. He also says, let all, this is also from dialogue with Trypho, let all the seed of Israel fear him. And when it is said that he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and when it is written in the memoirs of him that this so happened, as well that he changed the names of other two brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, this was an announcement of the fact that it was he by whom Jacob was called Israel, and Oshea called Jesus, Joshua, under whose name the people who survived of those that came from Egypt were conducted into the land promised to the patriarchs. So he mentions the so-called memoirs of Peter, and he mentions that two incidents happened in the memoirs of Peter, namely the sons of Zebedee, James and John, are called Boanerges, meaning sons of thunder, and Simon is called Peter. Now, neither of those occurs in the excellent fragment we have of the so-called Gospel of Peter, but both are in Mark, and the sons of Zebedee incident is only in Mark. And so that suggests that he's actually talking here about the Gospel of Mark. And this is consistent with what we see with in the testimony of other church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian of Carthage, that the Gospel of Mark is based upon the preaching and the eyewitness testimony of the Apostle Peter. And of course, it seems very unlikely it would go from being the memoirs of Peter, according to Justin Martyr, to the Gospel of Mark, unless the early church fathers had very substantial reason to think that Mark really was the true author of the Gospel that now bears his name. Because Mark is a much more obscure character than Peter. Mark is very he's a very, very minor character in Acts. He's only sparingly alluded to a couple of times, and he He's best known for having abandoned Paul in Pamphylia on a mission and causing a split between Paul and Barnabas in Acts 15. So it seems like an unlikely attribution of authorship, and it certainly seems unlikely it would go from the Memoirs of Peter, according to Justin Martyr, to the Gospel of Mark. So that's also a point to bear in mind. Now, Clement of Alexandria, also he wrote in the late 2nd century as well, and he says, "Have you anything to eat here?" said the Lord to the disciples after the resurrection, and they, as taught by him to practice frugality, gave him a piece of broiled fish, and having eaten before them, says Luke, he spoke to them what he spoke. And so this is an example of many that could be cited of the Gospels being quoted by the early church fathers and explicitly called by their traditional names, Gospel, Luke, etc. Another example from Clement, and to prove that this is true, it is written in the Gospel by Luke as follows, and he quotes from Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Another example, this is from Clement again. He says, and in the Gospel according to Matthew, the genealogy which begins with Abraham is continued down to Mary, the mother of the Lord, etc. Another quote from Clement, he says, and John the Apostle says, no man hath seen God at any time, etc. And so he says, Mark, the follower of Peter, while Peter publicly preached the gospel of Rome before some of Caesar's equities and adduced many testimonies to Christ, in order that thereby they might be able to commit to memory what was spoken of, what was spoken by Peter, wrote entirely what is called the Gospel according to Mark. As Luke also may be recognized by the style, both to have composed the Acts of the Apostles and to have translated Paul's epistles to the Hebrews. And so again, we see attestation to the traditional authorship of the four Gospels. We also read in, this is a quote of Clement by Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History. It says, so then, through the visit of the divine word to them, the power of Simon was extinguished and immediately was destroyed along with the man himself. And such a ray of godliness shone forth on the mind of Peter's hearers that they were not satisfied with the one's hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine proclamation, but with all manner of entreaties and importuned Mark, to whom the gospel is ascribed, he being the companion of Peter, that he would leave in writing a record of the teaching which had been delivered to them verbally, and did not let the man alone till they prevailed upon him. And so to them we owe the scripture called the Gospel by Mark. Another church father, Irenaeus of Lyon, in Gaul, what we now know as France, he says in his Against Heresies, and I quote, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, similar to Papias's testimony, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what has been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon the breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. And Irenaeus is significant because he, by his own testimony, was a disciple of Polycarp, who, according to Irenaeus, was a disciple of the Apostle John. So you have this unbroken chain of custody from John to Polycarp to Irenaeus. And so I think that is a significant piece of evidence for, at minimum, the authorship of the Gospel of John. And by extension, it also, I think, bolsters his credibility in relation to the other Gospels as well. Tertullian of Carthage wrote late 2nd, early 3rd century, and in his Against Marcion, he says, and I quote, we lay it down as our first position that the Evangelical Testament has apostles for its authors, to whom was assigned by the Lord himself this office of publishing the gospel. Since, however, there are apostolic men also, they are yet not alone, but appear with apostles and after apostles, because the preaching of disciples might be open to the suspicion of the affectation of glory, if there did not accompany it the authority of the masters, which means that of Christ. For it was that which made the apostles their masters. Of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instilled faith into us, while of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. The Muratorian canon is the earliest canonical list, and unfortunately, it's not complete. It only exists as a fragment, and so Matthew and Mark are not listed in the Muratorian canon, but it seems highly probable that they were included. The Muratorian canon shows knowledge of there being 4 Gospels, and it specifically mentions Luke and John in the fragment that we possess. So the third book of the Gospel, that according to Luke, the well-known physician, Luke wrote in his own name in order that after the ascension of Christ, and when Paul had associated him with himself as one studious of right, nor did he himself see the Lord in the flesh, and he, according as he was able to accomplish it, began his narrative with the nativity of John. The fourth Gospel is that of John, one of the disciples, and so forth. So the Muratorian canon is also a testament to the traditional authorship of the 4 Gospels. Now, let's look at the unanimity of early Christian attestation to the 4 Gospels. So there's no debate in the early church as to who wrote the 4 Gospels. It was completely unanimously recognized that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the authors of the 4 Gospels. There's no competing tradition. This chart shows the various church fathers, Marcion and Valentinus, that you see with represented with the letters M and VA. These are heretics. The others are church fathers who are aligned with Orthodox Christianity. And in the cases where they mention one of those Gospels approvingly, they get a tick. When they fail to mention it, they get a dot. And when they mention it disapprovingly, they get an X or cross. And you can see that the 4 Gospels and Acts are unanimously accepted as being authentic, in contrast to the apocryphal Gospels that were indeed forgeries in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. So here's, for example, the same church fathers and their approval or disapproval concerning the apocryphal Gospels, or composed by the Gnostics, and you can see that there's far less there's far less acceptance of those sources. You can see that they're generally not mentioned, or when they are mentioned, they're mentioned disapprovingly. And contrast that again with what we see with the 4 Gospels, where there's a complete unanimous acceptance. There's no debate over their authenticity or over their canonicity or over their authorship. And in fact, there's a wide geographical spread of attestation. So Irenaeus, I mentioned, wrote from Gaul, what we now call France, in the city of Lyon. Papias wrote in Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. Clement was writing in Alexandria, in Egypt, and Tertullian wrote in Carthage, in North Africa. And so when you see this wide geographical spread and a completely unanimous attestation, that seems to me to be quite compelling reason to think that the traditional authorship is in fact correct. You'd be more, if the Gospels were initially circulating anonymously, then it seems more likely that there would be a diversity of attribution, especially over such a geographical spread. And remember what I mentioned earlier, that with the Greek manuscripts that we do have that remain extant, all of them have the name of the author written on it: the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, etc. And so that, again, is very surprising if the Gospels were initially circulating anonymously and no one knew who wrote them until much later, especially given that they settled unanimously on, in the case of Mark and Luke, quite obscure and minor characters. So Martin Hengel, in his book, The 4 Gospels, says, and I quote, "If the Gospels had first circulated anonymously and be given their titles only at a secondary stage and independently of one another in the different communities because a title was needed for announcing, reading, and worship, this necessarily have resulted in a diversity of titles, as can be illustrated by many examples from antiquity. There is no trace of such anonymity." Contrast this with the letter to the Hebrews, which really did circulate anonymously, and you can see again there is a diversity of assigned authorship. So you've got Greek manuscripts that assign it to just titled to the Hebrews, or to the Hebrews written from Rome, or to the Hebrews written from Italy, or to the Hebrews written from Italy by Timothy, or to the Hebrews written from Rome by Paul to those in Jerusalem, or to the Hebrews written in Hebrew from Italy anonymously by Timothy. So again, you see a diversity of attributions here. This is not what you see with the canonical Gospels. You have other attributions of Hebrews, like the climate of Rome, for example, and others. So that's an important contrast. It is unlikely, I think, that the Gospels first circulated anonymously. This is what Graham Stanton has to say in his book, Jesus and Gospel. He says, and I quote, "As soon as Christian communities regularly use more than one written account of the actions and teachings of Jesus, it would have been necessary to distinguish them by some form of title, especially in the context of readings of worship, right? If you have these different circulating Gospels, as soon as you have more than one, you have to have a way of distinguishing them. And if the way of distinguishing them was different from the way that we now have of distinguishing them when we call them the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it seems very surprising that that manner of distinguishing them has not been preserved in the record, either on the manuscript tradition or in the early church father writings. So what then, in summary, is the significance of the patristic witness? Well, the early attestation to the authorship of the Gospels is, as I've said before, unanimous and very geographically widespread. And this is surprising if the Gospels are originally anonymous, compared with the letter to the Hebrews, as I just mentioned. It's unlikely that a book that was circulating around the Roman Empire without a title for almost a century could somehow come to be attributed to exactly the same author by scribes throughout the world, while leaving no trace of any disagreement in our manuscripts. Furthermore, Mark and Luke, who are very obscure characters, are unlikely choices for a false gospel attribution. The later forgers of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries uniformly attribute their gospels to high-profile figures like Peter, Thomas, or Philip, not individuals who are not eyewitnesses, and particularly obscure individuals like Mark and Luke. Now, you might say, well, Luke claims explicitly in his prologue not to be an eyewitness, so they were stuck with trying to find someone who was not an eyewitness. But I mean, there are higher profile characters that you could go for even then, like Barnabas, for example. And Mark is very obscure in Acts. He shows up, he's mentioned very briefly in Colossians as being a cousin of Barnabas. But he shows up only a couple times in Acts, and he's best known for causing the split between Paul and Barnabas over him having withdrawn from them in Pamphylia. So very, very unlikely choice of author if you're just going to make up an author to gain credibility for your gospel. Okay, so given Matthew's profession as a tax collector, moreover, he's also a somewhat surprising choice because tax collectors were seen by the Jews as being traitors. So that's a less strong point than for Mark and Luke being unlikely candidates, but again, it's still relevant. Even though Matthew was a disciple, he seems like an unlikely choice or a surprising one, given that he's a tax collector. And from the time there was more than one gospel in wide circulation, as I said, readers would have needed some way to distinguish them from one another. And Papias was a disciple of the Apostle John, according to Irenaeus in his Against Heresies, and Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, and Clement of Alexandria was a disciple of elders who knew the apostles. So these are individuals who are in a position to be in the know. And the external evidence, moreover, is consistent with the internal indications of authorship. And this is an important point, that you have this convergence between external attestation and the internal indicators of authorship. And so it's that to which I now turn, the internal evidence of authorship of the four Gospels. I'm going to focus really over on the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, both for the sake of time and also because I think that the internal evidence for the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John is considerably stronger than that for Matthew and Mark. And so I'm going to focus on the Gospel of Luke and John in this presentation. So a major problem with the theory of gospel anonymity, that is the theory that the Gospels just circulated anonymously in the beginning, is Luke's prologue in Luke chapter 1. He says, and I quote, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught." And then also in Acts, it's addressed to the same official by Theophilus. In the first week of Theophilus, I've dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach and so forth. And so he's addressing this official by the name of Theophilus, and we don't know very much about. And but it seems unlikely that if Luke is addressing or dedicating his work to this guy Theophilus, it seems very unlikely that Theophilus had no idea who had written the gospel or who was addressing him. And so that, again, suggests that we're not dealing here with a gospel that circulated anonymously. By the way, another example of a source that circulated anonymously, another example of a source that where the name is not contained in the actual text, and so it's technically anonymous, is Clement of Rome in his letter to the Corinthian church. We know that Clement wrote it because Irenaeus describes a letter that matches what we have in First Clement, and he attributes it to Clement of Rome. I don't think that it initially circulated anonymously, though, because it seems very unlikely that, given that Clement was addressing the Corinthian church, it seems very unlikely that the Corinthians had no idea who was writing to them. So I don't find that argument convincing at all. There in fact seems to be some quite compelling counter evidence. Now, the author of Luke Acts was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So we've reviewed this evidence in detail before, so I won't belabor the point too much and go through all the evidence again, but I'll just make a few points quickly. So Craig Keener, in his excellent 4-volume set on the Book of Acts, in Volume 3, he says, and I quote, "It is no coincidence that the we narratives provide the most detailed account in Acts. The missionaries' brief time in Philippi received more detailed attention than 18 months in Corinth, and as much as 2 years in Asia. The scholars often attribute the many accurate details of travel in 21:1-3 and 7-8 to a diary, and that Paul's 2 years in Judea, 21:17 through 27:1, are the most detailed portion of the book." And in past sessions, we've reviewed both internal and external evidences that the author of Luke Acts is very familiar with Paul's travels and knows incredible levels of detail, both in terms of Paul's activities as well as his knowledge of the world that is best explained by him being a traveling companion of Paul. This is before an age of Wikipedia and Google, where you can look things up readily. And his many casual, incidental allusions that we can corroborate historically is quite incredible. I recommend Colin Hemer's work on this subject, the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history. I recommend Craig Keener's work, both his shorter, condensed commentary on Acts as well as his 4-volume set. And I recommend James Smith's book, The Voyage of St. Paul, as well as Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, and of course, William Paley's work, Cora Paulinae, which translated from the Latin title means the times of Paul. I highly recommend those books if you want to dig in further, or indeed go back to the session of the course on the YouTube channel where we discuss the evidence from undesigned coincidences for the reliability of Acts, and the session where we discuss external confirmations of the Book of Acts. So check those out if you want to dig in further, but I won't belabor the point further. So if we go to we can also see that the author of Luke Acts must have been present with Paul in Rome. So in Acts 28:16, it says, when he came into Rome, this is the use of the inclusive plural pronoun, when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with a soldier who guarded him. So that gives us a short list of who might be the author of Acts and Luke. Everyone agrees, for a very good reason, that Luke and Acts, whoever wrote them, are composed by the same individual. So any argument bearing on Acts also bears by extension on Luke as well. So here's a text from Colossians 4 that indicates which of Paul's companions were present with him during his imprisonment in Rome. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you always, struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. Now, we can actually employ a process of elimination to arrive at Luke as the best candidate of this short list. So Aristarchus is distinguished from the author on the way to Rome in Acts 27:2, as well as earlier in 20 verses 4 and 5, and implication in 19:29. Demas, according to 2 Timothy 4:10, deserted Paul, so he's an unlikely author of Luke Acts. The author seems to have been a Gentile. The author seems to have he seems to have been a Gentile, given that Luke likely traveled with Paul to Jerusalem as a representative of the Gentile churches in Acts 20. And also from his geographical competence and his interpretation of Judaism, most scholars consider it pretty certain that he was not a Palestinian Jew. Now, if that's the case, if he is indeed a Gentile, which seems likely, then that rules out the men of the circumcision, who would be Jews. So that rules out Aristarchus, Mark, and Jesus, who is called Justus. The author's lack of interest in the Lycus Valley also may render Epaphras unlikely. So Epaphras was from Colossae, according to 1:7 and 4:12, and the city of Colossae in the Roman province of Asia was located primarily on the south bank of the Lycus River, inside the Lycus Valley, near the foot of Mount Cadmus, southeast of Hierapolis and southeast of Laodicea. So that's also some evidence against Epaphras being the author, though not conclusive. This makes Luke, I would argue, the most probable candidate, which is consistent with the patristic evidence. And so it's a remarkable convergence that the very author, who seems to be unanimously attested in the patristic sources, also happens to be the same author that we can show is the most probable author from this process of elimination. Okay, so this point is a bit weak, a weaker point, but I think it nonetheless carries some evidential value, and so it bears mentioning. So this point I obtained from Edmund Bennett, who wrote the book The Four Gospels from a Lawyer's Standpoint, which I commend to your reading. But he points out that there's various points throughout Luke Acts where Luke pays special attention to medical details that you don't find in the other Gospels. So while the other Gospels simply speak of Christ as healing a leper and of curing a man who had a withered hand, Luke says the first was full of leprosy. Luke alone indicates that it was a man's right hand that was withered in Luke 6:6. The others say Peter's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, but Luke writes that she was ill with a high fever. In the account of the healing of the centurion's servant, Matthew simply says the servant lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly in Matthew 8:6. But Luke, with more completeness, records that he was sick and at the point of death, in Luke 7:2. In the healing of the daughter of Jairus, Matthew merely states that her father addressed Jesus, saying, "My daughter is even now dead, but come and lay your hand on her, and she shall live." And Jesus took her by the hand, and the girl arose. But Luke, with more minuteness and tenderness of feeling, tells us that Jairus, it says of Jairus that falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying. While the other three Gospels mention that Peter cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest, Luke alone, with his more acute observation, adds, "And Jesus touched his ear and healed him." Luke alone mentions the compassion of the Good Samaritan. Luke alone records the fact that the sheep of the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane was induced by extreme sorrow, and that Jesus sweat great drops of blood, etc. He also, in Acts 9, mentions the scales that fell from Paul's eyes when he was healed of his blindness. So Edmund Bennett, in his book The Four Gospels from a Lawyer's Standpoint, says, and I quote, Now why there's more accurate observation and description by Luke of every circumstance of disease and of mental and physical suffering than can be found in any other historian of the same events? What was there in Luke's history or life which qualified and induced him thus to note and describe all kinds of diseases so much more minutely than the others? Turn to Colossians 4:14, and you have the answer, where Paul, writing to the Colossians, closes his letter thus: "Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you." Did the forger of Luke's gospel conspire with the forger of Paul's epistle, the one to put into Luke's mouth words which a physician would naturally utter, but without intimating that he was a physician, and the other to simply call him a physician without giving any any circumstances indicating it. Forgers do not rest content with such roundabout confirmations. On the other hand, truth-tellers do not trouble themselves to make their stories collaborate each other, but these are either forgeries or true tales. So much for Luke, end quote. So again, I think this is a weaker point, but I think that it has some implicit evidential value there. And so it contributes to a broader cumulative case. Now let's look then at the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John claims to be an eyewitness of Jesus' life in 1 John 1 through 4. So pretty much everyone agrees that whoever wrote the fourth Gospel also wrote 1 John, irrespective of whether that individual was John, the son of Zebedee. But in 1 John 1, in his prologue, he says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, and we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testified to it, and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father, and it was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father, and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete. And so, this is a direct claim to being an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. And you'll notice that the author distinguishes between us and you. So he's not just talking about generic humanity that have seen and touched Jesus with their hands and so forth. Rather, he's talking about his community. He says, the life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us, etc. This is consistent with what we also see in his gospel. In fourth gospel, in chapter 21, verse 24, speaking of the beloved disciple, the author says, this is a disciple who's bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, so this is sometimes employed or sometimes used by critics of Johannine authorship to say, no, actually, the author is denying being the beloved disciple, not affirming that she's a beloved disciple, because the author here appears to distinguish himself or themselves from the beloved disciple. Notice this is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things and has written these things, and we know this testimony is true. Well, who's the we? Well, I think this is similar to what you have in Romans 16:22, where Paul is writing to the Romans, and then suddenly his scribe, Tertius, interjects to send his greetings. He says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So I don't see that as being particularly problematic, especially in light of the prologue in 1 John, and the other clues also support the beloved disciple being the author of the fourth gospel. Furthermore, earlier in chapter 19, verse 35, we read, he who saw it has borne witness, his testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you also may believe. Speaking about the spear wound in Jesus' side. So the narrator indicates that the disciple whom Jesus loved was standing by the foot of the cross, and so that makes sense with the beloved disciple being the one in view here. So that's in chapter 19, verse 26. The disciple whom Jesus loved is said to be standing at the foot of the cross. So that makes perfect sense if the beloved disciple is, in fact, the author, and that seems to be what the fourth gospel is claiming. Now, we don't just have to take his word for it. There's actually internal evidence that suggests that the beloved disciple is the correct assignment of authorship for the fourth gospel. So I've mentioned this example before when we covered undesigned coincidences, but it's relevant here, and so I'll mention it again. So we have an undesigned coincidence that's internal to John. So in John 18, verse 10, it says, this is at the Garden of Gethsemane, Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, John is the only gospel that gives us the name of the high priest's servant, the one whose ear Peter had cut off. No other gospel's account of this event gives us the name specifically. Now, you might wonder, well, how does the author happen to know the name of the high priest's servant? How does he know that the name is Malchus when no other gospel gives us that information? Well, it seems that he must have some sort of insider information here. Well, if we continue reading and get to verse 26, 27, it says, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and once the rooster crowed. So this is one of Peter's denials of Jesus. Now, again, John is the only gospel that gives us a specific identification of who this individual was. It was a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. How does the beloved disciple? How does the author of the fourth gospel know this? Now, if we read verse 15 and 16 of the same chapter, we learn that Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, bear this other disciple in mind as we inspect who this is. Now, it continues, since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Peter stood outside at the door. So, this other disciple who's followed Jesus along with Peter is known to the high priest, and that's why he's allowed to enter into the courtyard of the high priest, whereas Peter has to stand outside until a bit later. Who is this other disciple who followed Jesus? Well, we learn in chapter 20 that Mary Magdalene, after discovering the empty tomb, ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him. So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. So the other disciple, this is a very close companion of Peter, appears to be the disciple whom Jesus loved. You can also see in John 19:26, when Jesus is on the cross, there is, Peter's left at this point, having denied Jesus. There is a disciple remaining, namely the beloved disciple. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And so that makes sense, given if the author of the fourth gospel really is the beloved disciple. We've seen from chapter 18 that this individual, the beloved disciple, is known to the high priest. That makes sense of why of how the author came to know the name of the high priest's servant. Now, an objection that sometimes comes up here is, but isn't it unlikely that a fisherman would be known to the high priest? And so this is sometimes being used as an argument against Johannine authorship of the fourth gospel. But I think this is really to do a priori history. To say that John the son of Zebedee was known to the high priest isn't to say that they were besties, right? There were some sort of acquaintances, and perhaps they had some family connection. We just don't know. But it seems very dubious to engage in a sort of a priori history and say, well, he was a fisherman, so he couldn't possibly be known to the high priest. I just don't think that follows at all. Another interesting observation is the absence of a disambiguator with the name John referring to John the Baptist. This is a somewhat weaker point, but I think that it nonetheless is really striking and worthy of attention. So John the Baptist in John's gospel is an exception to the generalization that the gospels disambiguate common names. We've talked about that tendency to disambiguate common names on the previous session. John was the fifth most popular name in Palestine at that time. And so it's very striking that John the Baptist alone, in John's gospel specifically, is the only individual who's not disambiguated. And it's not that he doesn't have a disambiguator. I mean, he was referred to widely as John the Baptist. That's how the other gospels refer to him. And that's how other characters refer to him. But why in John uniquely is John the Baptist simply called John? Contrast the narrator's meticulous distinction between Judas Iscariot and Judas not Iscariot, who asked Jesus a question at the Last Supper in John 14:22. So Lydia McGrew, in her book The Eye of the Beholder, says, and I highly recommend The Eye of the Beholder, by the way, for a tour de force treatment of the reliability of John and indeed its the traditional authorship. So she says, and I quote, "If the author himself was named John, he would not have been in the habit of disambiguating his own name, because he would not commonly be speaking of himself in the third person. And the only other prominent person in his narrative named John would be, in fact, John the Baptist. Perhaps under those circumstances, John the Baptist would simply become John in the mind and voice of the author when telling these particular stories." Another, so we can start to narrow down our pool of options in terms of discerning who the author is. We can see that the author was a Jew, because he's intimately familiar with Jewish opinions and customs, the unexplained references to the prophet, Jesus' disclosure of himself as the Messiah and the Savior of the world to the Samaritans, who will not confuse this revelation with Jewish national aspirations. So if you remember in John 4, the woman at the well of Jacob's well, the woman of Samaria, she is the only individual outside of Jesus' close circle to whom he discloses his identity as the Messiah. And he doesn't, as he does with so many others, tell her, hush, hush, don't tell anyone of this. In fact, she goes back and tells everyone that she thinks she's found the Messiah. Now, why is why does he not have any qualms about disclosing his messianic identity to her, whereas he does to so many others? Well, the Samaritans, of course, only accept the 5 books of Moses, and their concept of the Messiah differed from the rest of the Jews. So their concept of the Messiah was as a prophet who would reveal knowledge and so forth, and explain things and impart teachings. Whereas the Jewish messianic expectation generally was more akin to a militaristic leader who would overthrow the Roman occupiers and so forth. And so Jesus can disclose his identity to the Samaritan woman, knowing that she's not going to confuse this revelation with Jewish national aspirations. The low popular estimate of women in 427, the Judean disparagement of the dispersion in 735, the popular expectation the Messiah will remain forever. The foundation of his religious thought is Judaism, the chosen people to whom the Messiah came. His Greek is full of characteristics of someone whose native language was Aramaic, the limited vocabulary, the simple syntax, the use of conjunctions. For example, his frequent use of kai for adversative as well as coordinative conjunction, just like the Aramaic. All point to that conclusion. Several times when he quotes the Old Testament, his quotations are closer to the Hebrew text than to the Septuagint, the Greek translation that the Jews often used in Jesus' day. We can also say he was a native of Palestine. He gives us an unerring portrait of the distinct role that the hierarchical class, the Sadducees, whom he never calls by their name, played in the religious life and legal deliberations of Judaism. He also shows effortless precision in his knowledge of places and topography. Cana of Galilee, from which he went down, literally downhill to reach Capernaum. Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is distinguished from the better known Bethany near Jerusalem, itself described with precision as about 15 furlongs or 2 miles from the city. Ephraim near the wilderness, the dimensions of the Sea of Galilee, the view from Jacob's well, which would include Mount Gerizim and the fields of corn, the location of the pool of Siloam and the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, the fact that Jesus was walking in the colonnade of Solomon at a time of year when this roofed walkway protected by a wall would have afforded protection from the winter winds. By these and numerous other details, the author shows himself to be a native who is writing of places he knows personally. We can also say that he was an eyewitness of many events that he records. We've looked already throughout this course at very minor details that John gets correct, confirmed by undesigned coincidences and extra-biblical corroborations and other categories of evidence. But the details about persons, numbers, and times are also too numerous and too specific to be the work of someone who is inventing details or passing on oral traditions. And bear in mind that many of those very minor and specific details we can actually confirm and cross-check with these undesigned coincidences and extra-biblical confirmations, as we've reviewed previously. The Gospel of John overflows with details of objects and scenes not found in the other Gospels that are evidently stamped on the memory of the writer. The loaves of feeding of the 5,000 were barley loaves. When the ointment was poured out for Jesus' anointing, the house was filled with its fragrance. The branches strewn at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem were palm branches. When Judas went out to betray Jesus, it was nighttime. Jesus' tunic was without seam, woven from the top throughout. The headcloth found in the empty tomb was wrapped together in a place by itself. So remember, the modern historical realistic novel would not be invented for another 16 centuries. This superabundance of specific details is actually unlike the novels of the 1st and 2nd centuries. It's clearly the work of an eyewitness. He also mentions when Jesus cooks breakfast on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in John 21, for 7 of the disciples, he mentions specifically 153 fish, which is a very specific number. He was part of Jesus' inner circle. He's familiar with the scenes where only the disciples are present. They're calling, the journey through Samaria, the feeding of the 5,000, the visits to Jerusalem in chapters 7, 9, 11, etc. He frequently describes their thoughts, feelings, and reactions. He knows both what they said to Jesus and what they said among themselves. He knows the places where they would go as a group without the company of strangers. He knows the misimpressions they had that were later corrected. And he knows Jesus' motives and meaning as only one intimately acquainted with them could. The scenes where the beloved disciple is recorded as being present are recorded with particular vividness and detail. For example, the conversation at the Last Supper, or the scene by the fire at night in the hall of Caiaphas' house. So who then was the beloved disciple? Well, from the lists of those present in some of the scenes, including cross-references with the Synoptic Gospels, he must have been either Andrew, Peter, James, or John. He cannot be Andrew, since Andrew appears with them in the opening chapter, and he cannot be Peter, since he appears with Peter in the closing chapter, and James was martyred too early to have written the Gospel. So by process of elimination, we arrived at the conclusion that the most probable candidate is John, the son of Zebedee. Now, let me review a few objections to the traditional gospel authorship. We've seen a remarkable convergence between both the internal indicators of authorship and the external confirmations. But what are some of the objections that are raised by skeptics? So Bart Ehrman says concerning the Gospel of Matthew, he says, moreover, Matthew's Gospel is written completely in the third person about what they, Jesus and the disciples, were doing, never about what we, Jesus and the rest of us, were doing. Even when this Gospel narrates the event of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him, not about me. Read the account for yourself. There's not a thing in it that would make you suspect the author is talking about himself. Now, this objection was actually addressed around 400 AD by Augustine of Hippo in his Against Faustus. He says, because Faustus brought up this same objection against the wrong guy, he says, Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew was not the writer of this gospel, because when speaking of his own election, he says, not he saw me and he said to me, follow me, but he saw him and said to him, follow me. This must have been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as not to have read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself, in the hope of getting hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. It is needless to resort to other writings to quote examples of this construction from profane authors for the information of our friends and for the refutation of Faustus. And so, in fact, Josephus, Julius Caesar, Xenophon, etc., are examples of authors who use the third person when describing scenes where the narrator is present. And so this is not a problem at all. It's actually quite common. Another objection is, but aren't the disciples uneducated fishermen? How then could they write the Gospels? So Ehrman says, and I quote, there are good reasons for thinking that none of these attributions is right. For one thing, the followers of Jesus, as we learn from the New Testament itself, were uneducated, lower-class Aramaic-speaking Jews from Palestine. These books are not written by people like that. Their authors were highly educated, Greek-speaking Christians of a later generation. Now, there's a number of problems here. One is that we know very little about Mark. He's only mentioned a couple times in Acts. He's alluded to briefly in Colossians 4. So that critique can hardly be applied to him because we know so little about Mark to say that he was uneducated. Luke was a medical physician, and so he can hardly be considered to be uneducated, as we learn from Colossians 4:14. Matthew was a tax collector and therefore probably literate and likely would have known how to write in Greek, the primary language of commerce at the time. So in fact, on page 38 of Misquoting Jesus by Bart Ehrman, Ehrman says, and I quote, throughout most of antiquity, since most people could not write, there were local readers and writers who hired out their services to people who needed to conduct business that required written texts, tax receipts, legal contracts, licenses, personal letters, and the like. Notice tax receipts. Now, who would be responsible for tax receipts? Well, a tax collector. So Matthew would almost certainly have to be able to read and write. So this critique then only applies to John, the author of the fourth gospel. But John seems to have been relatively well off, as we see in Mark 1:19-20, which indicates that his father Zebedee was wealthy enough to pay hired servants and plausibly could have afforded an amanuensis or a scribe. It's also possible that, because of course John left the fishing business, it's possible that he learned to read later. We know that John wrote his gospel in old age, according to Irenaeus. So these critiques aren't very compelling, in my opinion. Now, another objection is, well, if Matthew was an eyewitness, why does he copy so much from Mark? Well, the argument is, if Matthew was an eyewitness, why is he dependent on someone who was not an eyewitness for so much of his information? But if Mark is indeed based on the testimony of Peter, as the early church unanimously attests, it's not implausible that Matthew would have used it as a source. And there are, in fact, other examples of eyewitnesses who relied on other people's testimony when composing biographies of their own teachers. So, for example, when writing an account of the death of Socrates, the ancient Greek writer Xenophon, who was a disciple of Socrates, used the reports of another disciple named Hermogenes. And the reason was that Xenophon was not present at the trial and death of Socrates, whereas Hermogenes was. And so, in conclusion, contrary to what we've often been led to believe, the case for traditional authorship of the Gospels is, in fact, quite compelling. And so for further reading, I refer you to the books you see on the slide, The Eye of the Beholder by Lydia McGrew. The subtitle is The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. I also recommend B.F. Westcott's book, The Gospel According to St. John. I recommend Brant Petre's work for the very thorough discussion of the external evidence for the attribution of traditional authorship. It's called The Case for Jesus. And I also recommend Andrew Norton's multi-volume set, The Evidence of the Genuineness of the Gospels, and I particularly recommend volume 1 on authorship, because that's where he discusses the authorship of the Gospels. And so I'll close with that, and very happy to entertain any questions. Thanks so much for your attention.